My name is Francine Roush, and I'm a member of the Tuxedo's Town Board. I'd like to welcome you here this evening for setting aside a little time on a stormy summer night to be here for this very special event. Thank you. For the last 6 months, a small group of Tuxedo residents, with full support from our town supervisor, have put together finally a Tuxedo's first Economic Development Council. This is a particularly important evening, representing an opportunity for our community and neighboring municipalities to participate in what will be an ongoing dialogue to help shape a vision for Tuxedo and the area's future. Tuxedo's Economic Development Council extends an invitation to any interested individuals to join this effort. I had to get that plug in. Please feel free to call our town hall, and one of our council members will be in touch. On behalf of Ken McGar, town supervisor, and all board members, may I thank all council members, but in particular, Mary Irizarry, for her tireless effort in making this evening possible. Also instrumental to our program tonight is the support from Sterling Forest Partnership, Scenic Hudson, and National Park Service. Now, I will say, beginning with the greatest pleasure, I would like to introduce Ed McMahon. For those of you who are not familiar, Mr. McMahon is a community planner and attorney who has written and spoken on land use, planning, conservation, and historic preservation. He has authored 8 books and has a long list of credits, which I had the great opportunity to share with him this evening over dinner. There are a number of folks here in the room who spent the day touring the region. And again, without any further delay, please, a big hand for Ed McMahon, and thanks for being here this evening.
Thank you very much, and thank all of you for coming out on a nice sunny summer evening here. For those of you who are expecting the other Ed McMahon, I hope I'm not going to disappoint you. I don't have any big checks, but I hopefully do have some ideas and some information that may be of some value to you here in Orange County and whatever town you live in. I want to go ahead and, before I start the slides, I want to just say a little bit about what I do for a living. I work for the Conservation Fund in Arlington, Virginia. Most of you have never heard of us, but we are a national nonprofit land and water conservation organization. What we do is 2 things. First, purchase and protect land all over the United States, 1,500,000 acres since we were founded 10 years ago, and by Pat Noonan, the former president of the Nature Conservancy. We do things, we're similar to the Conservancy. All of you have heard of the Nature Conservancy, but we buy things they're not interested in buying. Among other things, Civil War battlefields, Revolutionary War battlefields, recreation sites, scenic areas, et cetera, et cetera. We're also unique in that we're the only national land conservation organization that has an economic development provision written right into our charter, which means we are also in the land development business. And we try to demonstrate in all of our activities in a wide range of things the relationship between conservation and economic development. But what I want to talk about tonight is this. We turn the lights down. Somebody could just dim them a little bit, Carl. Maybe not quite that dark, so I can at least see my notes. Is there a halfway? We can, I'll manage if it's. Okay, well, that's as good as we can do. Anyway, that's my son. His name is Sean McMahon. He's actually just finished his sophomore year at Syracuse University. And I've obviously liked this picture, and I've been using it for a very long time. And I like it because it reminds me of something that Aldo Leopold once said, and that is that everything is connected to everything else. And that's what I want to talk about tonight, the issue of connections. The connections between conservation and economic development, between green space and our quality of life, between the built environment and the natural environment. And perhaps most important and fundamental of all, about those connections between people and the land. 27 years ago, in a book entitled The Quiet Crisis and the Next Generation, Stuart Udall wrote something that is in many ways, I believe today, sadly, more true than ever. And I'll quote him. He said, "America today stands on a pinnacle of wealth and power. And yet we live in a land of vanishing beauty, of increasing ugliness, of shrinking open space, of an overall environment diminished daily by noise, pollution, and blight." Now, please don't misunderstand me. As a professional conservationist, I'm the first to recognize that the United States is the world's leader in environmental protection. And of course, over the last 25 years, we've passed all kinds of laws to clean up air pollution, water pollution, toxic waste, to protect sand dunes and wetlands and other critical environmental areas. We encourage energy conservation and recycling. We've added thousands of acres to our state and national parks, and we've added thousands of buildings and monuments to the National Register of Historic Places, of course, including many here in the state of New York. But the truth is, and we all know this, is despite all of that, the special character of our cities, our small towns, and our countryside has been disappearing faster than ever. And while we've been saving some landmarks like this, we've been losing the landscape that gives those landmarks their larger sense of meaning. And while we've been cleaning up air and water pollution, and yes, our air is cleaner, and yes, our water is cleaner, while we've been cleaning up air and water pollution, we've been losing our sense of place. I mean, if I were to take you up in an airplane today and suddenly airdrop you along a road outside of almost any American city, you wouldn't have the slightest idea where you were, because it all looks exactly the same. I mean, is it Albany or Allentown, Providence or Pittsburgh, Houston or Harrisburg? Who can tell? As Wallace Stegner once wrote, if you don't know where you are, you don't know who you are. And by that, of course, I think what he meant was that all of us have a fundamental need for a sense of orientation, for a sense of roots, for a sense of place. Now, what do I mean when I say sense of place? I mean explicitly that which makes our physical surroundings worth caring about. That which makes our physical surroundings worth caring about. Unfortunately, I believe that in all too many parts of this country today, we are suffering the social consequences of living in places that simply aren't worth caring about. Now, why do I say that? I say that because the public realm, what you see outside along the streets and highways of New York State, the public realm, our downtowns, our town centers, et cetera, the public realm is the physical manifestation of the public good. And when we neglect the public realm, we neglect the public good. Now, in recent years, all across this country, certainly true in the part of the world I live in the Washington, D.C. area, there's been this growing sense of dissatisfaction with the quality of new development. And for all the improvements in cleaner air and better water and better roads and better schools and faster computers and even more parkland, people still say, is this all there is? Can't our communities be more distinctive, more livable, more beautiful? Can't we have more connection with nature and the outdoors? Well, I believe that the issue for all communities, whether it's in New York State or anywhere else, is not whether you're going to grow. Growth is inevitable, and I believe desirable. But the destruction of community character and natural and cultural resources that so often accompanies growth in America today is not inevitable. Progress does not demand degraded surroundings. Tuxedo, Orange County, the state of New York can all grow without destroying the things that people love. The real question for any community is not whether you're going to grow. It's not whether you're going to change, because you are. The real question is how. Now, it's the failure to understand that which causes some people in my line of work to view all development as the enemy. And of course, that will polarize a community and will defeat an effort to create a successful community. So if development's not the problem, then what is? Well, it's what I like to call the patterns of development. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. When I say patterns of development, I mean three things. First, where do you put it? Second, how do you arrange it? Third, what does it look like? Where do you put development? How do you arrange that development? What does that development look like? Let me just give you an example. That's the cornfield at Antietam, Maryland. That is the site of the single bloodiest day in the history of the United States. 23,000 Americans fell there on a September afternoon in 1862. And if you went there tomorrow, you could almost visualize the waves of infantry moving across that field and sense the urgency and how history was changed there that day. And yet, 6 years ago, the National Trust for Historic Preservation called this one of America's 10 most endangered historic places. It's off the list today, thanks to a lot of hard work by many people. But what was it in danger of? Well, let's get in an airplane. We'll fly 100 miles to the south, to Spotsylvania County, Virginia. This is the site of the South's greatest victory in the Civil War at the Battle of Chancellorsville. This is the Salem Church, which was a key feature during the fighting at Chancellorsville. And this church was a makeshift Confederate fortress. And the fighting waged in the fields and forests all around that church. And after the battle, it was a hospital for both Union and Confederate wounded. The church is a national historic landmark. It has been lovingly restored. But it is a classic example of saving a structure and losing a place. Saving a structure and losing a place. Now, the problem here is not that we have a shopping center. The problem is where they put it. There are simply better places in America to put shopping centers than in the middle of our hallowed ground. And I can tell you that today, the supervisors of Spotsylvania County, Virginia, woe the day they allowed this to happen. They wish they'd simply moved it 1,000 yards down the road, in which case they could have had their cake and eaten it too. They could have had the economic development of a shopping center as well as the tourist dollars of those millions of Americans who seek out historic sites and places, particularly those associated with the Civil War. So, clearly some places are better for development than other places. Civil War battlefield is not the best place. A floodplain is not the best place. Probably the middle of Sterling Forest wasn't the best place either, and I congratulate you on achieving one of the greatest land preservation victories in the history of this country, certainly in the later part of the 20th century. Congratulations on what you've been able to achieve here. But, we still fight. We spend all our time fighting about, conservation versus development, kind of, and we always hear it posed that way. I mean, if you live where I live, people are always saying, you're for development, you're against development, or you're for progress and he's for preservation. And people think that's the only sort of choices that we have, And part of the reason that I think people think that is because of the way we've historically approached conservation in this country as well as the way we've approached development. Let me give you an example here. This is the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. This is our most visited national park. But what we've done there is, of course, we bought all the land and then we threw out all the people. So that if you went into Cage Cove next week sometime, we've, of course, hired actors to play the Appalachians that used to live there, okay? And, we think that's good conservation. And don't get me wrong, we're all about preserving national parks, one of the things we do. But we sort of think that's conservation. A park or preserve, we draw a line around, there's no people in it. And then we have this right next door. Welcome to Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, one of the gateways to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, a community that is so notorious that about 6 years ago, it was named in a nationwide public opinion poll as one of America's 3 ugliest communities. Now, that is not the kind of publicity that any community really likes, so the mayor of Pigeon Forge accused me. He called a press conference to deny it. And what did he say? He said, well, we can't be one of the 3 ugliest because the unincorporated portions of the county are worse than we are, was his defense. Now, but this is what kind of people think the choices are. A park or preserve with no people in it, that's like Sterling Forest. And then right next door, ugly, unfettered, environmentally destructive, anything goes development, even though the landscape there may be just as outstanding. Now, are those the only 2 choices that we have? Of course not. Of course not. We have a third choice. And the third choice is that we can have growth and development that respects and enhances the character of our communities and that complements the quality of our landscape. development can and is being planned and built all over this country today with a new awareness of the economic and social values of open spaces, natural areas, native plants and animals, historic sites and buildings, etc., etc., etc. The choice for communities, once again, is not about whether they're going to grow, but about how they're going to grow. And that's what this talk is really about. And, you know, it's about this connection between nature and commerce. There is a connection. And what I'd like to do is to show you, really just, I get to travel a lot, so you're going to get to see a lot of my travel slides, really, about what some other communities are doing around the country. And in the process, I hope I'll get you to think about some things you could do right here. Maybe you're doing most of these already. But what I've done over the last 15 years is work with literally hundreds of communities around the country, most of them in communities that are adjacent to, close to, or on the way to major public land holdings. A year ago, a couple of friends of mine and I published this book, Balancing Nature and Commerce in Gateway Communities, which really is sort of a lessons learned book. We have a lot of case studies in there. And I want to just talk a little bit about some of the lessons that we learned. The biggest lesson that we learned is that successful communities in America today almost always have some things in common. The who's who, of good places to live, work, and do business in America almost always have something in common. And what we've identified is that these factors are the things that communities really have in common. Have a vision for the future. How many communities ever even ask themselves the question, what do you want your town to look like in 20 years? What do you have in your community today that you want to be here in the future? If you could change anything about your community, what would it be? Successful communities almost always have a shared vision of the future. And those visions grow out of an inventory of their assets. Every community has some assets. Some of them are very obvious. Others are not so obvious. I'll talk some more about that. Let me give an example. The Research Triangle of North Carolina had 3 great universities. So they built their economic future by creating the Research Triangle. It's one of the centers for high-tech industry in America. But communities start off by inventorying their assets, and then they build all their plans, whether it's a land use plan, an economic development plan, tourism plan, whatever, around the preservation and enhancement of those things that make them unique. They build on what they have to begin with. Communities that try to reinvent themselves, we've had all these things, first it was convention centers, and then it was festival marketplaces, then it was aquariums. Everybody thinks there's sort of one big answer to things. And in a few cases that may be true, but in most cases it's not. One of my favorite authors who lives up here is a woman named Roberta Gratz, who wrote a book called The Living City. She talks about thinking small in a big way. And what she meant by that was that a lot of little things that grow out of a plan, a thoughtful plan, can oftentimes make a lot more difference to a community than one big, giant thing that can overnight change the character of a community, et cetera, et cetera. Successful communities use education, incentives, and voluntary initiatives, not just regulation. Zoning will not create a memorable community. I'm not against regulation. We need regulations of a variety of kinds, but regulation by itself will not give you the community that you want. You need to think about how to use both carrots and sticks. You need to think about how to create this vision, then get incentives to get people to give it. I'll show you some examples of this. Successful communities are willing to say no to bad development. And the who's who of good places in this country are those places that have said no, because when they do, they always get something better in the future. And I'll talk about what some of those communities are. Successful communities cooperate with resource managers for mutual benefit. When a public land resource and a local community fight with each other, that doesn't help anybody. When they cooperate, it becomes a win-win situation. Successful communities consider aesthetics as well as ecology, what a community looks like, as well as its economics, as well as its natural areas, et cetera, et cetera. Successful communities almost always have a quality of life lobby. This is a willing group of people willing to work to see that the vision is implemented. Now, the truth is, there is no place in America today that is a special place by accident. There is no place, no matter how beautiful, no matter how special, no matter how historic, that will stay that way by accident. The fastest growing part of the country today is the Rocky Mountain West. People thought that it would always be like this. But now here it is today. There's no place that will stay a special place by accident, which is why this visioning is so important, thinking about your future. Talk about a city that used this process that I'm talking about, Chattanooga, Tennessee. Now here's a city that in 1969 was called the most polluted city in America. It was known as a patch of rust in the Sun Belt. It had an unemployment rate about 23%. In 1995, it was named an international model for sustainable development. It has become the poster child of communities that have gone from sort of worst case scenario to sort of international model. Well, how'd they do that? Well, they did it by involving thousands of people at hundreds of meetings over a multi-year period to create a vision for the future. They created a plan for the future of Chattanooga. Now, people say to me, you know, I go to some parts of the country where planning is not a very good word. You know, but let me say this. Tell me the name of any successful individual, organization, institution, or corporation in America that doesn't plan for the future. Failing to plan simply means planning to fail. Chattanooga, Tennessee created a plan for the future. And this plan grew out of an inventory of their assets. And the two biggest assets they decided to have were, one, downtown Chattanooga, and two, the Tennessee River, which flowed through town. This is downtown. This actually is 1978. Here's that same spot today. There's 121 new businesses within 6 blocks of this picture. They've gotten over $1 billion in new investment in downtown Chattanooga. They have over 1 million tourists a year now, and their unemployment rate is below the national average. It started because they planned for the future. The Tennessee River, that's the Tennessee River Gorge. That's 15 minutes from downtown Chattanooga. They have the most successful land trust in the South, called the Tennessee River Gorge Trust. 26,000 acres of land there is now preserved. It's under conservation easement because they created a plan for the future. They created a plan for a 22-mile-long river park, cost $750 million. You say, whoa, what kind of money is that? Well, Chattanooga realized that the most important question any community should ask is not how much does it cost. The most important question a community should ask is, what should we do? Money will always follow good ideas. 20 years after they proposed this plan, 22 miles long riverfront park, is 3/4 of its way to completion. And the majority of the money for that park has come from private sources. This is the Walnut Street Bridge in downtown Chattanooga. This is an obsolete highway bridge. The Tennessee Department of Transportation was dying to tear this bridge down. In fact, they were ready to spend $4 million to do that. But because Chattanooga had a plan for the future, they said, we have a better idea. Why don't you give us the money you'd use to tear it down and let us turn it into the nation's longest pedestrian bridge, tying downtown to West Chattanooga, bringing about economic revitalization on both sides of the river, creating one of the finest linear park systems in the country that feeds into the river park that goes up and down the river now for 20 miles on both sides of the river. I talked about this idea of inventorying your assets. What do you have? Every community has something. Some things are obvious and some things are not. Now, if you were to go to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, it's pretty obvious what they've got. They have some of the most incredible scenery in the world. They have wildlife. They have open spaces. They have a rich Western heritage and open space heritage, etc. It's pretty obvious that, what their asset is. And in fact, in this part of the world, it's interesting, the University of Montana School of Economics did a study, found that the single major reason people were moving to the Rocky Mountain West was not because of low taxes, not because of regulatory relief. It was because of access to outdoor recreation and the scenic beauty of the area. Example, the Brandywine Investment Group used to be located in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. 2 years ago, they moved to Jackson Hole, Wyoming. simply because of access to things like this. Now that's Annapolis, Maryland. That's another community that the asset's pretty obvious. They have an incredible historic downtown. I mean, it's a community of, it's an international tourist destination because they didn't save one or two buildings, they saved the entire character of the community. And they built their economic future around the enhancement of what they already had. But in other places, the assets aren't so obvious. This is Lowell, Massachusetts. Here's a community that also had an unemployment rate exceeding 20% as recently as 1975. Had no sense of self. It was really sort of a dying, gritty industrial city. What it had was abandoned textile mills and a rich heritage as the birthplace of the textile industry in the United States. Well, that's where they started, and here's where they are today. They've restored 23 textile mills, 250 other historic buildings. Last year they had 900,000 tourists, and they've also had almost $1 billion in new investment. Here's a city that nobody thought anything about. Once again, they created a plan, they built it around the preservation and enhancement of what they already had, and they did a lot of very innovative things to implement that plan. Education, incentives, and voluntary initiatives. You don't need government to go out and plant a tree for you. Minneapolis, Minnesota, last year alone planted 10,000 new trees using their tree trust to do that. You could do that here, too. You got lots of trees already, but, think about all the kind of things that organizing volunteers could do. How about incentives? Let me show you an example. This is Stanton, Virginia. That's their downtown. That's part of their downtown. This is one of the most beautiful and healthiest downtowns in the state of Virginia in a small town. Virtually every building in downtown Stanton has been restored and is occupied and being used. They did not have an historic district until 2 years ago. They had no design controls, no demolition controls, no nothing. So how'd they do it? 15 years ago, they have a group called the Historic Stanton Foundation offered free design assistance to any downtown business owner who would restore the facade of their building. They wouldn't pay for the restoration. They'd provide free design assistance. One person did it. And then his neighbor came over and said, that's pretty neat. How'd you do that? And then 2 people did it. And then 5 people did it. And then 10 people did it. And then the entire town did it. And yes, now they do have an historic district. Now they do have demolition controls. Now they do have architectural review boards. Started off, though, with an incentive. This is downtown Estes Park, Colorado. This is the gateway to Rocky Mountains National Park. This is a town that used to be known as kind of a rubber tomahawk kind of town. People would sort of drive through Estes Park on the way into the Rocky Mountains National Park. Nobody would stay there very long. They would stay there just as long enough to get their gas and get out of there. And this was their downtown. That's the St. Vrain River. That's what they call a river out west. And it's all channelized. Now, people might have said, well, parking's a problem. Well, parking's, only a problem if there's some reason to stop there in the first place. So what did they do? The Downtown Business Association, the Chamber of Commerce, went through a visioning process. And they collectively and voluntarily agreed to take out that parking lot and restore that river. And guess what happened? Within 5 years, tax revenues alone in downtown went up by 23% in 5 years. People stayed longer and spent more. I'll show you some other pictures later on, some other things they did. This wasn't the only thing they did. But they gave people a reason to stop in this community and not just go into the national park. And this is one of the things that savvy communities are doing all over the country. Successful communities think about aesthetics. What they look like is important. The image of your community is everything. The image of your community design translates what you are, who you are, and that translates directly into dollars and cents, which is why successful communities think about, for example, preserving the view from the road. Lady Bird Johnson once said, we all know the difference between a road that beckons and a road that depresses. And isn't it true? Aesthetics. Now let's talk about some choices. Let's just, start off with the front door to your community. The front door is like, the gateway, the entranceway. It's just like with meeting a person, a good first impression is important and a bad first impression is hard to change. Would you rather visit the Woodlands, Texas, or Midfield, Alabama? Which one makes a better first impression? Which one looks like a community with a sense of pride and a sense of place? Which one